In the shadowed corridors of a derelict space station, where the air carried the faint tang of rust and despair, an alien queen stood tall upon her obsidian throne. Her form was both terrifying and mesmerizing, a towering figure with iridescent scales that shimmered like liquid starlight, claws as long as human forearms, and eyes that glowed with an intelligence far beyond mortal comprehension. Around her sprawled her court, a writhing mass of lesser creatures whose chittering voices echoed through the chamber like insects trapped in glass jars. The queen's voice cut through the cacophony with razor-sharp clarity. "Bring me the human," she commanded, her words dripping with disdain. The warriors at her feet scrambled to obey, their movements frantic yet precise, driven by fear of her wrath. Moments later, they dragged forward a lone human warrior clad in battered armor, his face obscured beneath a dented helmet. His posture betrayed no weakness. He stood straight despite the chains binding his wrists, though his silence spoke volumes more than any protest could have. "You dare call yourself a warrior?" the queen sneered, leaning forward on her throne. Her tail lashed behind her, its barbed tip striking sparks against the metal floor. "You pathetic little creature, hiding behind your machines and weapons while we conquer worlds with our bare claws." She rose from her seat, descending the steps toward him with predatory grace. Each step resonated like thunder, making the very walls tremble. Her laughter filled the room, cruel and mocking, as she circled him like a predator sizing up prey. "Look at you, trembling inside that shell of yours. Do you even know what true courage is? Or are you simply another cowardly ape playing soldier?" The human remained silent, his breathing steady beneath the weight of her scorn. It wasn't defiance but something deeper, unreadable, that burned within him. He didn't flinch when she leaned close enough for him to feel the heat radiating off her scaled skin, nor did he respond when her clawed hand hovered inches from his throat. Instead, he met her gaze, not with hatred or fear, but with an unyielding calmness that seemed almost unnatural. Furious at this lack of reaction, the queen snarled, baring rows of serrated teeth. "Mark my words, puny thing. When the day comes for battle, I will tear apart whatever illusion of bravery you cling to. And then, perhaps, you will understand why it is futile to challenge beings such as us." With those final taunts ringing in the air, she turned away, dismissing him with a flick of her wrist. The guards hauled him back toward the cells, leaving the queen alone once more atop her throne. Yet, if one were to look closely, they might notice how her glowing eyes lingered on the doorway long after he had disappeared, as though some part of her doubted the certainty of her own words. Far below the grandeur of the alien court, deep within the bowels of the station, the human warrior sat cross-legged on the cold, unforgiving floor of his cell. Chains still bound his wrists, but they hung slack now, useless against the resolve etched into every line of his body. A single dim light flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows across the walls, yet he paid it no mind. His focus was elsewhere, on memories, lessons, and truths forged in fire and blood. He thought of Earth, not as it was now, a fractured world struggling under the weight of its own hubris, but as it had been centuries ago, before the stars became battlegrounds. Back then, humanity had been young, naive even, believing itself invincible because it had mastered flight and steel. But time had taught them humility, forcing them to adapt, evolve, and survive against enemies who saw them as nothing more than vermin to be exterminated. That evolution hadn't come easily. It had been carved out of loss, pain, and countless sacrifices. His thoughts drifted to the mentors who had shaped him, the grizzled veterans who spoke of battles fought on distant moons, their faces lined with scars earned in places most humans couldn't pronounce. They had drilled into him the importance of patience, strategy, and understanding one's foe. "Never let them see your fear," they would say, "but never mistake silence for weakness." Those lessons had become the foundation of everything he was today. And then there was her, the woman who had first shown him what it meant to truly fight. She hadn't been a soldier by trade, but rather a scientist, brilliant and fearless, who had refused to abandon her research outpost even as alien ships descended from the skies. Together, they had faced horrors that defied imagination, relying not just on weapons but on wit, teamwork, and sheer determination. When she fell, shielding him from a blast meant to end them both, something inside him shifted forever. He stopped fighting merely to survive and began fighting to protect, to ensure that others wouldn't suffer the same fate. Now, sitting here in this dark cell, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The alien queen's mockery still rang in his ears, sharp and venomous, but it stirred no anger within him. Instead, it clarified something he already knew. Arrogance was often a mask for insecurity. Her insults weren't meant to break him, they were meant to bolster herself, to remind her followers, and perhaps even herself, of their supposed superiority. But he understood something she did not. Courage wasn't about loud declarations or reckless charges. Courage was about enduring, adapting, and waiting for the right moment to strike. As the hours passed, he began to move, stretching muscles stiffened by confinement. Slowly, deliberately, he tested the limits of his bindings, feeling for weaknesses. The chains were strong, yes, but they weren't perfect. Nothing ever was. With each subtle shift of his body, he gauged the tension, memorized the rhythm of the guard patrols outside his door, and listened intently to the hum of the station systems. Every detail mattered. Every second brought him closer to the day when he would prove her wrong, not with words, but with action. For now, though, he remained still, conserving his strength and letting the alien queen believe she had broken him. Let her think him a coward. Let her underestimate him. Because when the time came, it wouldn't be her claws or her throne that decided the outcome, it would be the choices made in the crucible of battle. And in that arena, he intended to show her exactly what humanity was capable of. The days stretched into weeks aboard the alien vessel, a labyrinthine construct of jagged metal and pulsating organic growths that seemed alive in ways that defied logic. For the human warrior, each passing hour was a test of endurance, not only of his body but of his mind. The alien queen's taunts lingered like a shadow over him, her words echoing in the silence of his confinement. Yet, rather than breaking him, they sharpened his resolve. He trained relentlessly, using the limited space of his cell to hone his reflexes and strengthen his body. Every movement was deliberate, every breath measured. Even shackled, he practiced forms and strikes, imagining scenarios where speed and precision would mean the difference between life and death. Outside his cell, the alien hierarchy buzzed with anticipation. The Queen's proclamation of an impending battle had spread through the ranks like wildfire, igniting both excitement and unease among her warriors. They viewed the human as little more than prey, a fragile creature unworthy of their attention. But whispers of doubt began to creep in, whispers fueled by the warrior's stoic demeanor and the Queen's inexplicable fixation on him. Why waste so much energy mocking someone deemed insignificant? Some of the lower-ranking soldiers muttered amongst themselves, questioning whether this human might harbor hidden strengths. Their doubts, however, were quickly silenced by the Queen's enforcers, who reminded them of their place with swift, brutal efficiency. Meanwhile, the Queen herself grew increasingly restless. Her initial amusement at the human silence had soured into irritation, then simmered into something darker. She paced her throne room, her tail slicing through the air with agitated swipes. Her glowing eyes narrowed as she replayed their encounter in her mind, searching for cracks in his composure that she might exploit. But there were none, or at least, none she could perceive. This absence of weakness gnawed at her pride, feeding a growing obsession with proving her dominance once and for all. To distract herself, she ordered raids on nearby human outposts, relishing the chaos wrought by her forces. Each victory bolstered her confidence, reinforcing her belief in her species' supremacy. Yet, no matter how many victories she claimed, the image of the human warrior remained etched in her thoughts. There was something about him, an unshakable calm, a quiet intensity, that unsettled her. It wasn't fear exactly, but a nagging sense that perhaps she had underestimated him. The idea rankled her, twisting her usual arrogance into something sharper, more volatile. Back in his cell, the human noticed these shifts in the atmosphere around him. The frequency of guard rotations increased, their gazes lingering longer on his form. Supplies delivered to his cell came faster, almost as if someone wanted to ensure he remained in peak condition. These small changes told him what he needed to know. The day of reckoning was drawing near. And while the Queen may have intended to crush him utterly, he sensed an undercurrent of uncertainty beneath her bluster. Perhaps she, too, felt the weight of inevitability pressing down upon them both. As the final preparations unfolded, the station thrummed with activity. Weapons were sharpened, strategies refined, and rituals performed to invoke the favor of their ancient gods. Amidst it all, the human warrior continued his quiet vigil, preparing not just his body but his spirit. He knew the coming battle would demand more than physical prowess. It would require cunning, adaptability, and an unyielding will to endure. Whatever the outcome, he vowed to leave no room for doubt. When the moment arrived, he would show the alien queen, and the universe, that humanity's greatest strength lay not in brute force but in resilience. And resilience, he thought with grim determination, was something they had in abundance. When the day of battle finally arrived, the atmosphere aboard the alien vessel crackled with electric tension. The human warrior was led from his cell, his chains removed but his hands bound loosely behind his back, a gesture meant to mock his supposed helplessness. Guards surrounded him, their weapons drawn, yet their expressions betrayed unease. Word had spread among the ranks about the peculiar prisoner who neither begged nor broke, and curiosity mingled with apprehension in their glowing eyes. As they marched him through the winding corridors, the hum of machinery gave way to the rhythmic pounding of war drums, reverberating through the station like a heartbeat. The arena awaited them, a vast chamber carved into the heart of the vessel, its walls lined with jagged spires and bioluminescent veins that pulsed with eerie light. At its center loomed a circular platform suspended above a pit filled with writhing, serpentine creatures whose fanged maws snapped hungrily at the air. Spectators crowded the upper tiers, their chittering voices rising in a deafening crescendo as the queen entered, flanked by her elite enforcers. Her presence silenced the crowd instantly, her glowing eyes scanning the scene with predatory satisfaction. "You see this, my children," she called out, her voice amplified to fill the chamber. "This is the so-called warrior of humanity, a race that clings to existence like parasites on a dying host. Today, we shall witness firsthand the truth of their cowardice." Cheers erupted from the gathered aliens, their cries echoing off the metallic walls. The queen descended to the platform, her tail lashing behind her as she approached the human. "Do you have anything to say before your end, little ape?" she sneered, circling him like a predator savoring the hunt. The human remained silent, his gaze fixed ahead, betraying no emotion. His calm unnerved her, though she masked it with a contemptuous laugh. "Very well," she spat. "Let the trial begin." With a wave of her clawed hand, the first challenger emerged, a hulking brute twice the size of the human, its muscular frame covered in thick, armored plates. Roars of approval erupted from the crowd as the beast charged forward, intent on crushing its opponent in one devastating blow. But the human was ready. In a fluid motion, he dropped to one knee, evading the brute's charge, and used its momentum to yank free the bindings around his wrists. Before the creature could recover, he drove a precise strike into its exposed flank, exploiting a weak point between its armor plating. The audience gasped collectively as the brute staggered, roaring in pain, before collapsing onto the platform with a thunderous crash. Silence fell over the arena, broken only by the queen's low growl of frustration. "Another," she barked, pointing to a second challenger, a lithe, insectoid creature with razor-sharp limbs and lightning-fast reflexes. This time, the human moved differently, adopting a defensive stance as the creature darted around him in a blur of motion. He waited patiently, analyzing its movements until he spotted a pattern. Timing his counter perfectly, he sidestepped a slashing limb and delivered a calculated kick to the creature's thorax, sending it spiraling into the pit below. Its shrieks were abruptly silenced as the serpentine beasts tore it apart. By now, murmurs rippled through the crowd, their earlier confidence wavering. The queen's expression darkened further, her pride wounded by the spectacle unfolding before her. She signaled for a third challenger, a towering quadrupedal monstrosity equipped with multiple sets of snapping jaws and whip-like tentacles. The human's jaw tightened as he assessed the new threat, knowing this would be his greatest test yet. The creature lunged with ferocious speed, forcing him to dive and roll across the platform to avoid being ensnared. Blood trickled from a shallow gash on his arm, but he ignored the pain, focusing solely on survival. Using the platform's uneven surface to his advantage, he maneuvered the beast into a precarious position near the edge. With a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, he leaped onto its back, gripping one of its tentacles and using it to swing himself upward. From there, he drove a makeshift blade, crafted from a fragment of discarded armor, into the base of its skull. The creature let out a guttural roar before collapsing, its massive body teetering dangerously close to the pit. As the dust settled, the arena fell eerily silent. The human stood amidst the carnage, breathing heavily but resolute, his chest rising and falling with exertion. The queen stared at him, her glowing eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time, doubt flickered across her features, though she quickly masked it with fury. "Enough!" she roared, raising a clawed hand to halt further challenges. "This display proves nothing. You are still nothing but a worm beneath my heel." Yet even as she spoke, the murmurs among her followers grew louder, tinged with awe and uncertainty. The human said nothing, meeting her gaze steadily, his silence speaking volumes. The battle may have ended, but the war, for respect, for survival, for dominance, was far from over. The queen's voice sliced through the tense silence like a blade, her words laced with venom as she stepped closer to the human warrior. Her tail coiled and uncoiled behind her, betraying the agitation simmering beneath her composed exterior. "Do not mistake survival for victory," she hissed, circling him once more, her claws glinting in the pulsating light of the arena. "You are still trapped here, at my mercy. Your pitiful display has only delayed the inevitable." But the human did not flinch. He stood tall, his chest rising and falling steadily despite the exhaustion etched into every line of his body. Blood trickled from the gash on his arm, but he paid it no mind. His eyes remained locked on hers, unwavering, as if daring her to strike him down then and there. The crowd above them had grown restless, their earlier jeers replaced by murmured debates and uneasy glances. Some clung to their loyalty to the queen, shouting insults in an attempt to drown out the growing unease. Others watched the human with something akin to reverence, their chittering voices softening into contemplative tones. "You think this changes anything?" the queen spat, her voice rising to fill the chamber. "You are alone. Outnumbered. Outmatched. What can one fragile creature do against an empire that spans galaxies?" She leaned in close, her hot breath washing over him, carrying the metallic tang of her rage. "Tell me, little ape, what will you do when I take everything from you? When I burn your worlds to ash and scatter your people to the void?" For the first time since the battle began, the human spoke. His voice was low, steady, and devoid of fear. "You've already taken everything," he said, his words cutting through the din like a knife. "My home. My family. My future. But you forgot one thing." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the arena. "You can't take my will." The queen recoiled slightly, caught off guard by the quiet ferocity in his tone. Her glowing eyes narrowed, searching his face for any sign of bluff or bravado. But all she found was truth, a resolve so unshakable it made her chest tighten with something unfamiliar. It wasn't fear, she refused to acknowledge such weakness. And yet, there was something about him, something primal and unyielding, that unsettled her in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. "Enough!" she roared, slamming her clawed hand against the platform. The impact sent shockwaves rippling through the metal, causing the spectators to recoil instinctively. "Guards! Take him back to his cell. Let him rot until I decide what to do with him." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, though only she noticed. She turned away abruptly, unwilling to let anyone see the flicker of doubt that lingered in her gaze. As the guards moved to seize him, the human allowed himself a small, fleeting smile, one so subtle it might have been imagined. He offered no resistance as they led him away, his steps deliberate and measured. Though his body bore the scars of battle, his spirit remained unbroken. Each step he took echoed with purpose, a silent declaration that the fight was far from over. Back in his cell, the human sat cross-legged once more, his breathing slow and controlled. Despite the physical toll of the battles, his mind was sharp, racing through possibilities and strategies. He replayed every moment of the fight in his head, analyzing each move, each decision, and how it had affected the outcome. There were lessons to be learned, not just for himself, but for those who would come after him. If humanity was to survive, they would need more than brute strength. They would need cunning, adaptability, and unity. He thought of the whispers among the alien crowd, the way some of them had looked at him, not with hatred, but with something resembling respect. It was a crack in the armor of their collective arrogance, however small, and cracks could widen into fractures with enough pressure. Perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but someday the tide could turn. Someday, the aliens might realize that humanity was not the weak, insignificant species they believed it to be. The sound of footsteps outside his cell interrupted his thoughts. Heavy boots clanged against the metal floor, accompanied by the faint hum of energy weapons being powered up. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing not the usual guards, but a group of elite enforcers clad in sleek, black armor. Their leader stepped forward, his helmet obscuring his features, though the insignia on his chest marked him as one of the Queen's most trusted lieutenants. "The Queen requests your presence," the lieutenant growled, his voice distorted by the modulator in his helmet. "Come quietly, or we will drag you there ourselves." The human rose to his feet slowly, his movements deliberate. He knew better than to resist. Not yet. Whatever the Queen wanted, it wasn't going to be pleasant, but it was an opportunity. An opportunity to learn, to observe, to find weaknesses he could exploit. Without a word, he followed them, his senses attuned to every detail, the rhythm of their steps, the subtle tension in their postures, the faint whir of machinery hidden within the walls. They led him not to the throne room, but to a smaller chamber deep within the vessel. The air here was colder, heavier, and carried the faint scent of ozone. At the center of the room stood the Queen, her back to him as she stared at a holographic projection hovering in midair. It depicted a star map, dotted with markers indicating human settlements. Her tail twitched irritably as the lieutenant announced their arrival. "My Queen," the lieutenant said, bowing low before retreating to join the other enforcers stationed along the walls. The door sealed shut behind them with a definitive clang, leaving the human alone with the Queen. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without warning, she gestured toward the hologram. "Do you see this?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost contemplative. "These are your worlds. Fragile, scattered, easy prey. Yet you cling to them with such desperation. Why? What is it about these insignificant specks of dust that makes you fight so fiercely?" The human studied the map, his gaze lingering on the markers that represented colonies he had once called home. "Because they're ours," he replied simply. "Not because they're perfect, or strong, or even worth defending in your eyes. But because they're ours. Because every life matters. Because hope survives where despair tries to take root." The Queen tilted her head, studying him with renewed interest. "Hope," she repeated, the word tasting strange on her tongue. "A dangerous concept. It blinds you to reality. Makes you reckless. Weak." "No," the human countered, meeting her gaze steadily. "It makes us resilient. It gives us something to fight for, even when the odds seem impossible. Hope isn't weakness, it's strength. Something you'll never understand." Her eyes flashed with anger, but also with something else. Curiosity, doubt. He couldn't be sure. Before she could respond, the ship shuddered violently, throwing both of them off balance. Alarms blared throughout the vessel, red lights flashing as the artificial gravity fluctuated. The hologram flickered and dissolved into static. "What is happening?" the Queen demanded, turning to the enforcers. One of them activated a communication device embedded in his wrist, listening intently before responding. "My Queen, we are under attack. Human forces have breached our perimeter. They are attempting to board the vessel." The Queen's lips curled into a snarl. "Impossible! How could they have found us?" She whirled back to the human, her claws extended menacingly. "Did you plan this? Did you send a signal while we kept you prisoner?" The human shook his head, his expression grim but resolute. "I didn't need to. Humanity doesn't give up. Not ever. You should know that by now." For the first time, uncertainty flickered openly across the Queen's face. She hesitated, torn between confronting the invaders and dealing with the man standing before her. In that brief moment of indecision, the human saw his chance. With a sudden burst of movement, he lunged forward, seizing a discarded weapon from the floor and aiming it squarely at her chest. "This isn't over," he said, his voice cold and steady. "Not by a long shot." And as the sounds of battle raged outside the chamber, the two adversaries faced each other once more, ready to determine the fate of their respective species. The Queen's eyes burned with fury, but beneath the surface, a flicker of fear ignited. For the first time, she saw him not as prey, but as an equal, a dangerous adversary who had outmaneuvered her at every turn. Her tail lashed violently behind her, striking sparks against the metal floor. "You think this changes anything?" she snarled, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Even if you kill me, my people will destroy yours." The human tightened his grip on the weapon, his stance unwavering. "Maybe," he replied, his tone calm yet edged with steel. "But your reign ends here. And maybe, just maybe, that'll be enough to give us a fighting chance." Before she could react, the chamber doors exploded inward, sending shards of metal flying. A squad of human soldiers stormed in, their armor battered but their resolve unshaken. They moved with precision, forming a protective barrier around their comrade while training their weapons on the Queen and her enforcers. The air crackled with tension as both sides hesitated, the moment balanced precariously on the edge of chaos. "Stand down," one of the soldiers barked, his voice amplified through his helmet. "Surrender, or we end this now." The Queen let out a guttural laugh, though it lacked its usual venom. "Surrender? To you? Never." She raised her claws, preparing to strike, but the human stepped forward, blocking her path. "It doesn't have to end like this," he said, lowering his weapon slightly. His gaze softened, not with pity, but with something akin to understanding. "You don't have to keep fighting. Your empire is crumbling, whether you admit it or not. Let it go." For a heartbeat, silence filled the room. The Queen stared at him, her glowing eyes searching for deception, for weakness, but finding none. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders sagged. The weight of centuries of conquest, arrogance, and bloodshed seemed to press down upon her all at once. Her claws lowered, though her expression remained defiant. "You truly believe your kind can win?" she asked, her voice quieter now, tinged with something that might have been exhaustion. "Even after everything we've done?" "We're still here," the human replied simply. "That says enough." The Queen closed her eyes, exhaling sharply. When she opened them again, the fire within had dimmed, replaced by a strange, hollow resignation. Without another word, she turned away, signaling to her enforcers to stand down. The humans exchanged wary glances but held their positions, unwilling to trust her completely. As the standoff dissolved into uneasy truce, the human approached the holographic console, studying the star map once more. He pointed to several key locations marked as supply hubs and military outposts. "If we hit these targets, we can cripple their operations across the sector," he said to his comrades. "This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about reclaiming what's ours." His words resonated deeply, igniting a spark of hope among the weary soldiers. Together, they began coordinating their next moves, their voices steady and determined. Behind them, the Queen watched silently, her pride shattered but her spirit oddly reflective. Outside the vessel, the battle raged on, the stars bearing witness to humanity's relentless fight for freedom. Though the war was far from over, one truth became undeniable. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the refusal to let fear dictate the future. And as long as even a single human stood ready to defy the darkness, the light of hope would never fade. The Queen's enforcers stood frozen, their weapons lowered but their bodies tense, as if unsure whether to obey her command or strike back. The human warrior glanced at his comrades, nodding subtly, and they began securing the chamber, confiscating alien weapons and binding the enforcers with energy cuffs. The Queen didn't resist, her claws resting limply at her sides as she stared at the floor, her iridescent scales dulled under the harsh red lights of the alarm. "You've underestimated us," the human said quietly, stepping closer to her. "Not just me, but all of us. You thought we were weak because we value life, because we fight for something greater than conquest. But that's our strength. It's why we'll always rise, no matter how many times you try to crush us." Her glowing eyes flickered up to meet his, and for a moment, he saw not hatred but sorrow. It was fleeting, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but it lingered in the air like an unspoken truth. She turned away, her voice barely audible. "Take me to your commander. If this ends now, I will face judgment. But do not expect me to beg." The human hesitated, then nodded. "Fair enough." As the group moved through the corridors, the sounds of battle grew louder. Explosions rocked the vessel, and the distant hum of plasma fire echoed through the halls. Human soldiers clashed with alien warriors in brutal skirmishes, each side fighting with desperate ferocity. Yet amidst the chaos, there was a shift, a glimmer of unity among the humans, a shared purpose that had been forged in the crucible of survival. Reaching the bridge, they found Commander Vera, a seasoned leader whose presence radiated authority. She assessed the situation quickly, her sharp gaze locking onto the Queen. "So this is her," Vera said, her tone neutral but firm. "What do you propose we do with her?" "She surrenders," the warrior replied. "But she's also a bargaining chip. Use her to negotiate peace, or at least a ceasefire. We can't afford more bloodshed." Vera considered this, then nodded. "Agreed. But trust is earned, not given. She stays under heavy guard until terms are set." The Queen said nothing, her pride wounded but intact. As she was led away, the human warrior exhaled deeply, leaning against the console. The weight of everything, the battles, the losses, the sacrifices, pressed down on him, but he felt lighter. Hope wasn't just a concept, it was alive, breathing, tangible. Outside, the tide of the battle began to turn. Reinforcements arrived, human ships cutting through the alien fleet with precision and resolve. For the first time in years, the stars seemed brighter, their light piercing through the darkness. And though the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, one thing was certain: humanity had proven itself unbreakable. Not because they were stronger, faster, or fiercer, but because they refused to give up. Together, they would rebuild, reclaim, and endure. Because hope, once ignited, could never truly be extinguished.